Okay, students, welcome to this module. It's module 3 in the program, the Postgraduate Diploma in Disability Studies. Now, this third module in the package is called Effective Strategies for Inclusion, and we're going to be focusing on the practical classroom-based approaches and as we call it, strategies that you can adopt to meet your learners' diverse needs. And the learners we're referring to in this module will have a range of barriers to learning or disabilities. So to begin, I would like you to approach this module very systematically. So I urge you to work through your study guide and to download and read as many of the e-reserves as possible. In your tutorial letter 101, I've given you step-by-step guidelines for how to access the e-reserves for this module via the UNISA library. Please do not go straight to the assignments. I need you to read with understanding and to really have a conceptual grasp of the importance of thinking through how you include the learners in your classroom. So the focus in this module is on continuous assessment. You're not going to write an end-of-year exam. Instead, we're guiding you to work very systematically through the 4 study units of this module. But we're not just focusing on assessment, we're focusing on learning about effective strategies to include learners. So I urge you to work through your study guide before you attempt the assignments. In many cases, students are asking questions about the assignments, and I can immediately see that they haven't done the readings. So in this module, my aim is to provide you with a range of practical teaching strategies that you can implement in your classroom to accommodate your diverse learners' strengths, their needs, and their abilities. And so it's by no means complete. This module is introducing you to these practical strategies. But, within the Department of Inclusive Education, we're really urging our students to continuously build on this. You need to see your teaching strategies as something that you are continuously extending. You're continuously learning, you're continuously exploring additional strategies. I do not know in advance, just as you cannot know in advance, who your learners will be in 2022 or in 2023 or in any year in the future. And so depending on who your learners are each year and what their specific needs are going to be for support, you will have to continuously expand your teaching strategies. Effective strategies for inclusion. We have 4 learning outcomes, and our assessment is linked to these 4 learning outcomes. The first thing we're going to explore are the philosophical underpinnings on which the concept of inclusive education is based. We're also going to look at the learning theories. You're going to analyze these theories, and you're going to think about how they influence effective strategies for teaching in both inclusive and special education settings. And thirdly, you're going to design a learning program in which you implement an adapted curriculum for learners with a range of different needs, abilities, and interests. Here, we're going to focus on learners with specific disabilities. We're also going to guide you to assess the applicability of various teaching strategies through various scenarios and case studies. So the module then promotes an awareness of what inclusion is. Now, the first challenge we have in the field of inclusive education, and this is something that scholars, academic students around the world are grappling with, that there's no single globally accepted definition. There's no consensus among all of us working in inclusive education of what inclusion is. It's a very complex and contested concept. Now, you might ask, why is this the case? The case is that the reason for this dilemma really is that we approach inclusive education from very different philosophical approaches, very different models of what disability is. In many countries, disability was something that was approached from a predominantly medical model of disability. So the urge is to look for treatment or cure. We want to eradicate the disability. From the social perspective, which comes from the field of critical disability studies, a rights-based approach to education, the argument has been that the disabilities are not the issue, it's the social barriers that prevent learners to participate in education, in learning, and in their communities and society at large, and that is what disables individuals who have these various challenges or barriers to learning. So what I urge you to do is to formulate your own definition of what inclusion is, using your study guide to guide you and to include some of these key concepts. So the first concept we encounter in this module is that of diversity. And so, my colleagues and I in the Department of Inclusive Education, we often would say that it's not so much about whether learners have impairments or barriers. It's just that teachers and the community at large needs to understand that every learner is unique, that every learner should be approached as an individual. And so our focus is diversity rather than disability. But certainly in this program, we are much more cognizant of the fact that learners do have these significant barriers that prevent them from learning effectively. The second concept you will encounter is access. So we, working in inclusive education, a lot of our work is based on the fundamental right to education. So we work in the perspective of every child, every learner has the fundamental right to reach their full human potential, and therefore they have the right to support. And so regardless of what the learner's individual needs are, the system needs to be responsive and provide access to education. So access is the first requirement, but access extends beyond physical presence within the classroom or school. We don't just want access to education, we want participation, because if learners are just physically present and they're not doing anything and they're not learning anything and they're not actively engaging in learning and teaching, then they will not be able to reach their full potential as learners. And so participation, you've got to think about, what do I need to do in my classroom to ensure that every learner is participating actively, every learner is participating meaningfully, every learner is able to learn. So participation might need a range of accommodations. We call it modification or support to ensure that learners are actually participating in a way that learning is happening. And so the third requirement is achievement. Every learner must experience success. When we deal with curriculum modification or accommodations or adaptation later, you will see that unless you adapt assessment, your learners will not achieve. So of all the things we adapt, we never adapt the learning outcomes. They remain unchanged. but the way in which learners participate, the way in which learners are engaged must ensure that they are successful and achieve and develop to their potential. Right. So those are the three sort of requirements, but you'll see there the first is for you to recognize the importance of diverse learners as you define inclusion for yourself. And then just a few aspects that I'd like to suggest that you could incorporate into your definition is that it's about equal opportunities for all learners to learn, and for learners with disabilities to learn alongside their typically developing peers. So if a child is not accommodated in an ordinary inclusive school with their same age peers and their siblings, the idea from the Salamanca statement was that every learner is accommodated in the school and that learners learn in a social environment. So peers and siblings, they go to school, the closest school to where the home is. So very much a community-based approach, okay? Learners shouldn't be traveling long distances to school, but in reality they do. And so we know that inclusion in South Africa and in many other countries is happening on a continuum where we have different kinds of schools. We have your mainstream ordinary school, we have something called full service schools, and we have special schools. Now, placement in the special school should be the exception and not the rule. And this is why in this program, we're looking at how to include learners with disabilities so that they learn in social environments of the classroom alongside their typically developing peers, and that the child attends the same school as their typically developing siblings. The moment that doesn't happen, you're creating huge additional challenges for parents and families because children are now at different schools, and that only should happen when, for example, you have a child in a primary school and an older child in a high school. But what we're seeing is that children that are even close in age are in schools that are far apart. Okay, so this is not what is ideal. And then inclusion is regarded as the best preparation for real life. And the reason we argue this is that inclusion in classrooms and schools is preparation for inclusion in society and inclusion within the world of work. So whatever we do when it comes to learners with disabilities, ultimately our goal is that they should be independent, that we should think about their overall well-being, that we should think about their achievement and their fulfillment as human beings, and that they have the right to work. And so there's a lot of policies that you would encounter in some of the other modules in this program that really advanced rights-based approach. And we position inclusive education within, a social justice orientation for this reason. And so we also think about, how we facilitate access to the general curriculum. The general curriculum is, our goal, because this will facilitate quality instruction, education, and better developmental outcomes. The moment we do not facilitate access to the general curriculum, then the outcomes of learning are much more uncertain. And then learners also need to receive support to develop communication skills in a natural setting. So children learning together, communicating with one another, learning alongside one another, the social engagement, the communication that naturally occurs. We cannot recreate it very easily in special education settings. And then the ideal really is to expose learners to academic content. Through exposure, we are communicating higher expectations also. So we do not know what learners are capable of. But if we don't expose them to academic content and knowledge and skills, we limit their possibilities for learning. And of course, as I've been saying, in all of this is the interaction between learners themselves to learn from one another. Many of the teaching strategies that we employ allow learners to engage peers in small groups and in the classroom, but to learn from one another in a social context of schools. One of the things that you'll encounter in study unit 1 is the historic developments related to inclusive education. Now, there's just 3 things that I want to highlight, because you've got your study guide, and we do, expect you to read the content of the study guide, and as I've said previously, the e-reserves. But to summarize, okay? So firstly, South Africa, like many other countries, South Africa is a signatory to a whole range of international treaties, conventions, policies related to education for all. Inclusive education is very strongly tied to this concept that everybody must be having some form of access to education, wherever it is, okay? So we are not saying that it's inclusion at any cost. Inclusion can happen in different settings. So it depends on the learner's individual support needs. Then secondly, we need to consider, although we've got all these policy frameworks, and although we've got all these mandates for what we should be doing, are we doing it in reality? So we have to consider how implementation is happening and what the challenges and the constraints are and what the enablers could be. So we know, for example, that teachers might not have the attitudes that foster inclusion. So if teachers don't see themselves as responsible for every learner that enters the classroom, we have a problem. If teachers do not see themselves as responsible for teaching every learner who enters their classroom, we have a problem. If teachers think that learners with disabilities should be in this special school in a segregated learning environment, we do have a problem. And all of these things can constrain the effective implementation of inclusive education. But in teachers' defense, lots of the research is telling us that teachers need the pedagogical knowledge and skills, they need practical strategies, they need support in the reality of many of our schools having large numbers of learners. So how do you accommodate a range of needs and learners' diversity and all these conditions that we're talking about in this module if you're sitting with a large class size? And in some of our schools, teachers are sitting with teacher-learner ratios of in excess of 70 learners. So these are significant and real challenges. So we have to think about how do we, move beyond these constraints, because we cannot use them as sort of convenient reasons why we don't implement at all, okay? And then thirdly, we need to explain what are the requirements for effective implementation. So in this module, we want to give you practical strategies, but it's not a recipe book. I'm introducing you to some of the strategies that are available. This is why we give you the e-reserves and we give you the YouTube videos and we give you ebooks and other resources. I need you to really buy into this idea that I'm going to make a plan for the learners in my classroom, and I'm going to have different learners every year, and I'm continuously going to learn, you know, what the strategies could be that will work for me with my learners in my context. So, the students at UNISA are from around the world, and we cannot know where everyone is. So we really want to get your buy-in, that we're getting you, on your way, but you're going to take responsibility for this as a professional educator. So we really want you to think about what are the requirements for the effective implementation in the country where you are based, in the context where you are based. Our students are in urban areas, in rural areas, in peri-urban areas. Some of you are working with huge class sizes. So in your context, what would your requirements be? Okay, then next we deal with the philosophical underpinnings of inclusion. And in this module, we introduce you to some of the Afrocentric or Eurocentric approaches. And we definitely want you to be able to explain how inclusion can be implemented from these different philosophical sort of perspectives. So from an African perspective, we really want you to think about concepts such as Ubuntu, communalism, collectivism. You're not just an individual teacher working with your group of children in your classroom with the door closed. You've got to reach out to colleagues. You've got to reach out to parents. You've got to set up your own community of practice. You're going to be consulting. You're going to be collaborating with others to meet the needs of your learners. And so that's why we want you to draw that comparative analysis between African and European approaches. We're not rejecting all European approaches, absolutely not. But we're aware that in our South African and African context, we've overlooked the African perspective. And we really want you to have a balanced view here, okay? We want you to look at where your learners are coming from and what's appropriate in your context. So we do want to decolonialize. We do want to, value indigenous knowledge. We want to value what parents and children bring, their background knowledge, their cultural identity. All of those things need to be respected and recognized. And every learner in the classroom must have a sense of belonging. And so as teachers, we are really encouraged to embrace the linguistic, the cultural, and the developmental sort of profiles of our learners, and expect in advance you are going to have a diverse group of learners every year. And you, as a teacher, you are requested, or some people would say even expected, to accommodate that diversity in the most meaningful way.